This paper was written for a rather different audience than the august and distinguished one that's in this room today. So this was originally written as a keynote for the United Kingdom Defence Academy, where the audience largely consisted of senior officers and policymakers. And that provenance, I think, is reflected in two features of this paper. The first one is that, shockingly, it discusses real facts and a real case. So it's an attempt to come to terms in a way with my interpretation of the intervention of Libya in 2011. And also, I think now we think very much about the context of the situation in Syria also. And really to come to terms with what I felt to be a real missed opportunity in terms of the way that Western states and NATO handled that intervention, and the opportunity that I think we had, which we failed to adopt, which was to really develop a new and much better paradigm for the way that we conceptualize these interventions, but also the way that we conduct them in a very, very concrete way. So I try to talk a little bit about that in the paper. The second legacy, I think, is that some of the argumentation in this paper it covers a lot of ground, and some of the argumentation is very compressed. But no doubt we will unpack or decompress or deconstruct those arguments in Q&A later. So the rise of a conception of universal human rights is transforming the ethics of military action. The breadth and depth of this rights revolution is profound, and no aspect of military ethics will be left untouched. Nowhere has the transformative effects of human rights been experienced earlier or with more force than in the way that we think about military humanitarian intervention. In the last decade, the doctrine of responsibility to protect has successfully entrenched a conditional understanding of state sovereignty that makes human rights the touchstone of sovereign rights. This has been a genuine advance. But the current theory and practice of humanitarian intervention is, I want to argue, is at an unstable resting point in its development. It continues to suffer from significant conceptual and operational deficits. In this paper, I will ask a surprising question. Why should we conceive of military humanitarian intervention as a form of war? I will argue that in doing so, we deform key aspects of humanitarian intervention, which in turn underlies the significant political controversy that the practice continues to generate to this day. Instead of conceiving of intervention as a form of warfare, I will suggest that we approach it through the paradigm of what I want to call human sovereignty. This approach affirms the right of people to determine their own political settlements, their own arrangements, without violent coercive interference, either by foreigners or by compatriots. It thereby places significant strategic and operational constraints on the conduct of intervention, which I'll explore in detail, paying particular attention to the 2011 intervention in Libya. And if I had time, I might talk a little bit about how my view, I think, relates to a related view developed by John Stuart Mill and endorsed later by Michael Walzer. We'll see how we do for time. So let's step back and begin by reflecting on how we got to where we are today. In the old paradigm, foreign intervention to prevent mass atrocity was thought to reveal a deep tension between two different moral values or sets of rights. On the one side was the moral value of state sovereignty, which enshrines the right of states against intervention in their internal affairs and their inherent right to defend against armed attack. On the other side lay the human rights of individual persons. And in a widely read article, Kofi Annan referred to these competing values as two concepts of sovereignty: the political sovereignty of states and the personal sovereignty of individuals. When a state attacks its own people, then the two values were thought to come into a fundamental conflict, leading to what Annan called the dilemma of humanitarian intervention. As his language reflects, this conflict was viewed as a tragic one. No matter what course of action is taken, some important moral value will be compromised. Now, the great conceptual leap out of this dilemma form of thinking was achieved by introducing what is, in essence, a conditionality argument. Sovereignty in its normative sense should not be viewed as some kind of immutable and inherent attribute of states. Rather, a state's possession of sovereign rights is conditional on their respecting and protecting the rights of state citizens. the state fails in this responsibility, then its sovereignty becomes in part or in whole forfeit, and it is liable to external forceful intervention, provided such intervention is both necessary, proportionate, and appropriately motivated. So the analogy here is obviously with individual cases of self-defense, where an aggressor who forfeits his life, there's no kind of dilemma or tragic conflict there. One party has simply lost their rights. We understand that, right? So the conditionality argument was implicitly endorsed by the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, funded by the Canadian government, in their seminal report on responsibility to protect. But it didn't originate there. The basic form of this argument had already been well established in several prominent earlier discussions, including those by David Luban, Fernando Tesson, and Michael Walzer. Nonetheless, embedding the conditionality argument within the doctrine of responsibility to protect and the doctrine's endorsement by the United Nations General Assembly in 2005 was, I believe, a genuine advance. It enabled us to escape the loose and unsatisfactory image of a trade-off between competing intrinsic values implied by the dilemma view, and to move towards a shared understanding of the concrete conditions for permissible intervention. Most notably, of course, the four so-called responsibility to protect crimes, which are genocide, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and war crimes. And it also reflected the clear truth that states possess rights because of the rights of their citizens, not independently of them. However, even as the conditionality argument gained political traction and theoretical credibility, serious concerns remained. Many worries revolve around the seeming political nature of the current doctrine and its practice by states. First, there has been deep unease about forcible regime change in the course of humanitarian intervention, as can be seen by the reaction of many states and commentators to the NATO intervention in Libya. More broadly, there have been significant worries about the permissibility of intervening militarily to support one side in an ongoing civil conflict. This was the de facto status of the Libya intervention, and is clearly implicated in proposals current at the time of writing to arm rebel forces fighting against the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Some commentators have been concerned at the apparent weakening or abandonment of the traditional doctrine of impartiality in United Nations practice that this seems to reflect. And all of these reservations, I think, have been exacerbated by the apparent selectivity of the practice of intervention by Western forces. Why are some cases singled out for intervention when other, perhaps more serious cases are not? And in the background of all of this, of course, has been the kind of the shadow of the 2003 invasion of Iraq. So many people agree, there's a considerable consensus amongst many commentators, lawyers, and philosophers that this intervention was not justified, and indeed was without just cause. Yet the operations there were at various points justified as a form of humanitarian intervention, and moreover, the Saddam regime clearly lacked the moral legitimacy required to claim full sovereign rights. Now, these factors together, I think, they're a considerable and genuine source of disquiet for advocates of responsibility to protect. And they're all interlinked in that they concern problems with the way that intervention may improperly disrupt the indigenous politics of the community in question. Now, of course, this was exactly the concern, one of the central concerns, one of the central motivations for the original conception of sovereignty that we started with, right? The original non-conditional conception of sovereignty. So one conclusion that you might draw from all of this is that it was a mistake to abandon that and to move towards the conditional account that we find within responsibility to protect. That might be one conclusion that you would draw. My diagnosis, however, is a different one. I believe that all of these issues stem in different ways from the same basic error, that of conceptualizing, resourcing, and operationalizing humanitarian intervention as a form of warfare. This error, I think, can be corrected by rooting the doctrine and practice of humanitarian intervention in a richer notion of what I will call human sovereignty. Our conceiving of humanitarian intervention as a particular species of war was, I think, a very natural step, because most commentators have approached the issue of intervention from squarely within the just war theory tradition. Responsibility to protect report is a case in point. By structuring their argument around classical just war principles, including a very full-throated discussion of just cause, the Commission strongly implies that the responsibility to respond to humanitarian crises is, at the limit, a responsibility to engage in humanitarian war. Conceiving of intervention as a form of war is, I think, significant because, as Karl von Clausewitz rightly identified, war is deeply and inherently political. So he says, and I quote, "War is not merely an act of policy, but a true political instrument, a continuation of political intercourse carried on with other means." So to conceive of humanitarian intervention as a form of war, particularly when combined with the conditionality argument that we find within R2P, is therefore to see it as encompassing a permission to engage in deep intervention in the political processes of the target community. Now, it's certainly true that many commentators have emphasized the limited scope of permissible humanitarian intervention. So, for example, the ICCIS report insists that, and I quote, "the primary purpose of intervention must be to halt or avert human suffering," and that, I quote again, "overthrow of regimes is not as such a legitimate objective." But those warnings are presented in the context of a discussion of so-called precautionary criteria, of which one is, a discussion of the criterion of right intention. It describes as a precautionary criterion of right intention. And the report quickly acknowledges that intentions of interveners are most commonly mixed and frequently permissibly so. Moreover, the report leaves open the possibility that overtly political forms of interference in a community might be necessary as a means to achieve civilian protection. The practice of intervening states in Libya following the UN Security Council Resolution 1973, which explicitly references responsibility to protect, the first Security Council resolution to do so. So the practice of the states following UNSCR in 1973 suggests very clearly that the norm was interpreted by those states as permitting steps to engage in deep political interference amounting to forcible regime change. And there are a number of statements that Barack Obama and other NATO leaders are on record as effectively saying that. So limits on the political character of intervention have very shallow roots within the conditionality account of humanitarian intervention. After all, if, as the conditionality argument suggests, a state has forfeit its sovereign right against intervention, how exactly ought we to conceive of restrictions on political interference within that community? What is the normative source and content of such restrictions? What we require, I want to suggest, is a deeper account of the moral limits on the political conduct of humanitarian intervention without simply falling back on the earlier dilemma view that attributes a non-conditional status to state sovereignty. Right? So that's kind of really the puzzle that I want to set up. Now, I think that this account can be provided by reflecting more deeply on the way that sovereignty connects with human rights. As is well known, sovereignty was originally conceived as an attribute of states. The original conception of sovereignty, developed by theorists like Jean Bodin and Thomas Hobbes, meant that there could only be one supreme source of authority within a given territory. As we've already seen, Kofi Annan proposed that the concept of state sovereignty be complemented with a notion of what he called individual sovereignty, the rights and freedoms of individual persons. But it's crucial to understand that in a normative sense, it's the sovereignty of the individuals, not of the states, that are primary. The legal notion of state sovereignty is a descriptive concept. It means simply that the state is de facto capable of asserting supreme authority within its territory. But this de facto exercise of power tells us nothing about the state's moral right to assert that power. Sovereignty in its normative sense refers to a moral and political right. It means the right to manage one's own affairs without violent or coercive intervention by others. But that right of non-interference is possessed first and foremost by individual persons and only derivatively by states. But why is it that individual persons possess this, what I'm arguing to be morally primary right of non-interference? Well, ever since the Enlightenment, we've conceived of persons as being capable of possessing moral rights because of their status as free, equal, and rational moral agents. This trio of moral attributes constitutes what we might call the Enlightenment conception of the human subject. And I think it still provides the best account of why persons can bear rights. And as I'll suggest below, it informs also the content and the limitation of those rights. States and social entities can also possess sovereign rights, rights of non-interference, but they do so derivatively. Political sovereignty is a synthetic attribute. It is created when individuals join together in just political relations. Without an appropriate connection to a community engaged in just political relations, state sovereignty is simply a de facto monopoly of force that imposes no special obligations on others. How then should we conceive of these just political relations that are the ground, the source of collective sovereign rights that states enjoy? Now, that obviously is a central question of political philosophy and can't be addressed here. But one point that I think is clear is that a basic condition of just political relations is that those relations respect the sovereignty of individual persons. That is to say, the right of individuals to manage their own affairs without unjustifiable or violent coercive intervention by others. Right? Just politics, at the minimum, whatever else we say about it, has to be respecting of the rights of individuals. So all of this I take to be familiar and I hope reasonably uncontroversial. But I think that there is a very interesting and little noticed corollary of this that I think is really, really important. If it's the case that just political relations, these just relations which stand at the source of the sovereign rights of states, if it's the case that those relations are required minimally to respect the sovereign rights of individuals, then it seems to follow that just political relations have to exclude the conduct of politics through violence. Just political relations are necessarily non-violent. Why? Because political violence is the attempt to compel the will of others through a process of force. In doing so, it overrides or negates the status of those other people as free, equal, free and equal rational moral agents. Debate, persuasion, compromise, negotiation, horse trading, majoritarian voting, these are all characteristic modes of politics that engage with and recognize the rational will of others. But politics conducted through violent coercion is very different. It treats the will of another as an object to be acted on or overcome through force. And as Clausewitz explained, the attempt to overthrow the will of an enemy through force is the defining characteristic of that archetypal form of political violence, war. And I quote again, "Physical force," he says, "is the means of war. To impose our will on the enemy is its object." So political violence, and in particular warfare, are in this way, I think, antithetical to the most minimal standards of just political relations, because they fail to recognize the status of persons as rights-bearing moral agents. And it is precisely such relations that stand at the normative root of all political sovereignty. Now, crucial to this claim is a distinction between different ways in which violence can be employed by political actors or state agents. Because not all violence employed by political actors or state agents is political violence in the way that I want to use that term. Political violence, I think, is best understood as violence that is constitutive to the formation of collective decisions or outcomes. Right. Political violence is constitutive of the formation of collective decisions or outcomes. But not all violence employed by political actors or agents of a state are political violence in this sense. Consider, for example, a court of law that employs violence to enforce a legitimate sentence. Court officials do not thereby engage in political violence, as I'm using that term, and they need violate the rights of no person, or particularly of the condemned man. What is crucial is the distinction between what we might call input violence on the one hand and output violence on the other hand. Political violence employs violent coercion as an input to a collective decision process. An example would be if the prosecution used violent threats to influence the decision of the judge or jury, right? The violence is an input into this collective decision process. Legitimate law enforcement, in contrast, employs violence as an output of a decision procedure that is morally justified because it takes proper account of the rights of subject persons. And crucially, of course, one of the crucial ways that it does that is by excluding violence from that process, right? That's one of the conditions for it meeting that normative constraint. Political violence, that is to say, violence employed as a constituent of a decision procedure, always, I think, contravenes rights. Always contravenes rights. Whereas violence that is the output of morally justified decision procedures need not. So the fact that political sovereignty emerges from these forms of rights-respecting interactions explains, I think, why political sovereignty is conditional in the first place. A state can't claim the moral protection of political sovereignty when it is engaged in acts of political violence against members of its own community. This, obviously enough, is because the moral right of political sovereignty only exists because of the mutual practice of just political relations, a practice that I've just argued excludes political violence. So this whole account explains why the conditionality argument works the way that it does. But the conditionality argument is only half the story. It's crucial to understand that in a situation of humanitarian intervention, we have to deal not only with the negative aspect of sovereignty identified in the conditionality argument, right? The forfeiture or absence of the sovereign rights of the state. We also have to count for the positive aspects of political sovereignty, the fact that members of a community, right, those ordinary members of a community who are not engaged in the repressive or rights-violating actions, retain the sovereign right to manage their own affairs without interference, right? The right of what I'm calling human sovereignty. They possess this right as much against the political action of external interveners as they do against internal actors or perpetrators of genocide and atrocity. Now, it's that observation that lies at the core of this notion that I want to call human sovereignty. A humanitarian intervention conducted under principles of human sovereignty would combine the negative account that we find within the conditionality argument with a positive account of the right that people possess to forge their own political settlements, their own arrangements, free from violent interference, either by outsiders, external interveners, or by insiders, members of their own political community. Crucially, members of a community may continue to possess this positive right even when their government has forfeited its right against forceful foreign intervention. All right. Now, all of this so far has been very abstract. So what I'd like to do now is to try and make it a little bit more concrete by asking the question of what a humanitarian intervention informed by this kind of conception, this conception of human sovereignty, what would it actually look like? And how, crucially, how would it differ from the more traditional conditionality approach? Well, all accounts of humanitarian intervention begin with the imperative to prevent grave human rights abuses. But an intervention conducted under the conception of human sovereignty would insist on, as it were, a complementary strategic objective that would inform and support this primary objective. The complementary objective is to respect and to facilitate a tolerably just, and therefore, as I've argued, non-violent, indigenous political process within the community subject to intervention. Human sovereignty recognizes the fact that people have the right to forge their own political settlement through just political relations, unimpeded by violent interference by either compatriots or by foreigners. Even when the government might have forfeit its sovereign rights by engaging in atrocity or genocide, the right of human sovereignty may still be held by significant elements of the community. And this residual human sovereignty places significant constraints on the actions of interveners. In particular, two constraints, I think, are really important. First, I think, there is a general prohibition on providing sustained military support to one belligerent within a civil conflict. Interveners should not be in the business of picking winners among competing political factions. Even when one community or faction bears overwhelming responsibility for abuses, this does not justify providing sustained military support to its enemies. Humanitarian interveners ought not to become participants in a civil war. I think that this idea has three practical corollaries. First, in almost all circumstances, interveners ought not to provide direct military aid to one faction in a civil conflict. They may not provide weapons, training, communications, intelligence, logistical support. Second, interveners should not integrate or coordinate their operations with those of a particular faction, for example, by providing close air support, even when it may be operationally advantageous for them to do so. And third, interveners should explicitly declare their readiness to use force in order to interdict atrocities or other criminal acts, irrespective of who are the perpetrators. Right? This may entail the requirement to carry out operations when necessary, both against government and against opposition forces. And that alone, I think, has to rule out this idea of close operational coordination or integration. Now, this principle of no sustained coordination doesn't preclude acts of what you might call ad hoc cooperation with a particular faction to thwart an imminent massacre or atrocity. What it does preclude, I think, is a sustained campaign of support in which interveners integrate themselves militarily and politically with one particular side in a conflict. Interveners may use force to defend rights, but they are not entitled to become participants in a civil military conflict over the political destiny of the community. I think these operational principles are supported both by pragmatic and by moral reasons. Pragmatically, it's highly perilous to support an armed faction in a civil conflict about whom we may know very little. It is a seductive but profound error to believe that the enemy of the bad guys are the good guys. The opponents of an abusive regime may indeed be virtuous freedom fighters struggling to establish a just civil order, but they may equally be disempowered perpetrators in waiting, preparing to settle old ethnic or sectarian blood scores. It's particularly difficult to assess the moral status and true intentions of rebel actors, who typically have no previous record of government. To provide direct military assistance to one political actor in circumstances of uncertainty in this kind involves a moral and political recklessness at best, and at worst may involve complicity in international crimes. So there are pragmatic reasons for doing that. But I also think that there are deeper reasons, there are moral reasons for the prohibition on providing sustained military support. The notion of human sovereignty, as I've described it, implies that people have the right to determine their own affairs and political destiny without the violent or coercive interference by others. Now, that right is obviously violated by a state or other actor that commits the full responsibility to protect crimes. But the right is also violated by rebels or insurgents who employ force of arms against the state in order to forge a new political settlement. And by extension, it's violated by those who give them military support. Human sovereignty encompasses the right to a political process compatible with our status as free and rational moral agents. And that, as I've argued, entails at the minimum a political process not conducted through force of arms, through violence. This leads naturally to the second implication of the human sovereignty account. An explicit goal of intervention, of the interveners, should be to positively facilitate and foster this kind of process, right? An indigenous, non-violent political process consistent with what I'm calling the right of human sovereignty. Analytically, I think it's helpful to think of a hierarchy of 4 different kinds of processes by which political transformation can be achieved within a community. By transformation here, I mean a kind of profound political change, such as, for example, regime change or altered constitutional arrangements. There are essentially 4 different mechanisms that we might think about. The first mechanism is political transformation achieved through participatory constitutional mechanisms, right? Most notably, of course, are democratic mechanisms. But we could imagine other forms of legitimate participatory politics that are not fully or exclusively democratic. Number 2 is political transformation achieved through popular, non-violent, but extra-constitutional means. So you might think here, for example, about the classic strategies of non-violent political resistance: strikes, civil disobedience, mass mobilization, sit-ins, boycotts, and the like. These are all strategies by which a community or a segment of the community, as it were, withdraws its consent from current political arrangements. Number 3 is political transformation through violent military means: civil war, coup, insurgency, military revolution, and also their countermeasures: military repression and counterinsurgency. And finally, number 4 is political transformation achieved through atrocity, including the 4 responsibility to protect crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and war crimes. This last category is characterized by an attempt not merely to violently coerce a political opponent, like we're trying to do in category 3, right? We're not merely trying to politically coerce them, but we're trying to eliminate or destroy them entirely. Right? So those, I think, are the four basic mechanisms. Participatory constitutional mechanisms, non-violent but extra-constitutional mechanisms, violent military action like civil war and insurgency, and then finally atrocity and genocide. Now, the first thing to note about these 4 categories is that there is a clear hierarchy in the moral legitimacy of these processes from the first to the last. 1 and 2 represent what we might call the green zone of tolerably just political process. 3 and 4 represent the red zone of political processes that to varying degrees violate the right of human sovereignty. Moreover, the legitimacy of practices within the green zone is interlinked, right? So extra-constitutional civil disobedience is permissible to the extent that participatory constitutional avenues are either absent or deficient. Now, what I think that this analytical framework enables us to do is to observe how we ought to think about the operational context of humanitarian intervention. Humanitarian intervention, I think, is best conceived as forceful coordinated action that is required to protect persons from atrocity and that is conducted in such a way as to push actors out of red zone activities and into green zone activities, right? So what we want to do is we want to take people out of the domain of these what are called red zone activities, push them towards the green zone, the non-violent, either constitutional or extra-constitutional, but at least non-violent forms of political action. And I think it can do this first by providing credible security guarantees for those citizens who seek to participate in green zone political processes. And secondly, by seeking to marginalize and restrain those on both sides who engage in the last two, right, the red zone activities. And I think, as it turns out, in many circumstances, there's going to be a considerable overlap or synergy between these two goals. So these goals will present as overlapping. Now, I don't want to overplay this point. I think in a lot of cases, they may not do so. In a lot of cases, those two goals may come apart, and there may be a very significant tension between them. But one case in which I think there clearly was an overlap between these two goals was in Libya in 2011. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about that. So I think we can see this really clearly in this case. Now, the first thing to note about the Libya intervention is that the account that I've been giving, this account of human sovereignty, is, I think, entirely consistent with the reasoning that was employed by the Security Council in Resolution 1973. That resolution banned all non-humanitarian flights over the country and authorized NATO states to, and I quote, take all necessary measures to protect civilians in civilian-populated areas under threat of attack in the Libyan Arab Jamahiriya, including Benghazi, while excluding a foreign occupation force of any form on any part of Libyan territory. Now, the Council clearly didn't employ these terms, but this mandate seems very well calibrated to the demands of human sovereignty as I've been developing that idea, right? Interveners are authorized narrowly to protect civilians and the areas in which they live, and overt political interference is constrained by a ban on occupation of territory, right? No boots on the ground. So when you look at what you look at the resolution, you look at the Security Council reasoning, it sounds very, very consistent with the kind of idea that I'm talking about. But in fact, as soon as the intervention started to be conducted, it was conducted in very, very different terms. Early in the campaign, leaders of intervening states declared that the Gaddafi regime must end effectively. And they strongly suggested that this was an objective, a strategic objective of the operation. This impression was strengthened by close coordination with and military support offered to the rebel forces. In effect, NATO became the air combat wing of the Free Libyan Army. Sorties were undertaken against loyalist forces in rear positions that were not posing an imminent threat to civilians or to civilian-populated areas. Right? So they really became participants in an ongoing civil war rather than a force who viewed itself as having a mandate simply to interdict these criminal actions. The intervention was, de facto at least, an act of forcible regime change. This had two significant consequences, negative consequences. The first is that it gave the victorious Libyan military factions a very strong hand in forging the post-crisis political settlement. It's reasonable to assume that those factions include some of the more extreme actors within Libyan politics, whether or not, as was reported at the time, they included full-fledged members of al-Qaeda. Secondly, this de facto participation in the civil war, the second effect that had was that it tainted the notion of responsibility to protect in the eyes of many states. The perception that Western forces had grossly exceeded their mandate in Libya by transforming a civil protection mandate into a political transformation operation has made it much more difficult to achieve consensus in the Security Council for action to avert the ongoing crisis in Syria. But the real question, I think, is, all right, so in light of the way that the intervention was actually conducted, Security Council Resolution 1973 looks like a stillborn precedent for the concept of human sovereignty, right? It looks like a precedent that might have just been there, but in effect looks like it was stillborn. But the really important question is, was there an alternative, right? Could it have been done differently? Could it have been done in a way that would have appropriately reflected what I think is the mandate in UNSCR 1973, and also at the same time this broader conceptual apparatus that I'm describing as human sovereignty? Could we have done it another way? Well, imagine for a minute that the campaign in Libya had been conducted in a different way, being conducted on principles of human sovereignty as I'm describing it. What might it have looked like, right? How might it have proceeded? Well, recall that the crisis began not with an armed insurrection, but following examples in Tunisia and Egypt with a peaceful protest and civil resistance movement in major cities. A human sovereignty-based doctrine would have made this peaceful protest movement not the nascent armed insurgency, the center of gravity of operations. Right? The overarching strategy would have been to use air power to create a perimeter of tolerable safety around those engaged in peaceful protest in the urban centers. So the idea is to send a clear and explicit message out to the citizens of Libya, you have the right to attempt political transformation through peaceful protest. And if you exercise that right, then NATO will take appropriate steps to protect you from attack. At the same time, the armed insurgents would be marginalized through a refusal to provide direct military assistance to the broader insurgency campaign. In addition, NATO would have made clear that they interpret the UN mandate to also authorize strikes against rebel forces should they threaten civilians or civilian areas. Now, of course, as I said above, that wouldn't stop them from coordinating ad hoc with citizens from either faction who were collectively defending themselves against an imminent unjust threat, right? But it would rule out that broader integration and support. Now, two questions about this I think are really key. Could such a strategy have been effective in narrowly military operational terms? And second, what would have been the impact on the broader political context? Well, the truth is, we can't know. The truth is it's impossible to know the answer to the first question. I've spent a lot of time talking about these speculations with air power specialists. So we know that enormous advances have been made in the ability to conduct aerial surveillance and precision strikes, but nonetheless, urban areas remain an extraordinarily challenging environment for air power. What we can probably say is that a combination of fixed-wing, rotary, and drone aircraft employed in a situation of air superiority like we had in Libya in 2011 would probably have been sufficient to deny the regime the ability to use artillery, armed vehicles, massed columns of troops against a body of civilian protesters, right? You could stop the big forces coming in and bodily breaking up a group of protesters. But it's clear that air power alone could have provided scant protection, if any at all, from, for example, snipers hidden in a civilian building or against non-uniformed agents of the regime mingling among the crowd. Moreover, air power can do nothing against a state security apparatus used to terrorize and to torture protesters and those associated with them, their friends and family. Right? So you can't do anything about that. So, and of course, using air power in an urban environment would inevitably have led to accidental killing of civilians, right? So would such a precarious operational effect have been sufficient to achieve the objective of enabling a peaceful indigenous political process to run its course in Libya, right? Would it have actually had that effect? Again, the honest answer is that we can't know. But what is striking, I think, is that air power would probably have been sufficient to prevent the regime from using these large-scale military assets to bodily remove or dissipate a massive protest. It could probably stop them from doing that, while, on the other hand, leaving undisturbed its ability to use lower-grade forms of violence and terrorism and torture to coerce those group of citizens, right? Now, what that suggests to me is that the key determinant of whether the strategy could have been successful, the key determinant would actually ultimately have been the moral strength and cohesion of the protesters themselves, right? That's what's really would carry the day. And I think what gives hope is that throughout the whole Arab Spring movement, we've just seen incredible acts of courage and determination by people subject to just incredible abuse and coercion by their government. So that to me is a very, at least, hopeful indication. So let's assume then that the strategy that I've suggested, the strategy that I've outlined, right? So the strategy of making the peaceful protest movement the center of gravity, trying to protect that area, trying to push to one side the military actors from both sides to try and enable a space for this indigenous political process to run its course. Let's assume that we could have done that, just literally in terms of the operational effect. Let's assume that we could indeed have achieved a tolerable degree of safety for those engaged in civilian protest, at least sufficient to sustain that movement in the face of government opposition. What would have been the effect? I think there can be little doubt that if the civilian protest movement had been allowed to run its course or protected from bodily disruption in the way that I've described, then the Libyan regime would have gone the same way as the Mubarak and Ben Ali regime before it. It was utterly devoid of legitimacy and support, and without the ability to use these large-scale acts of violence, I think it probably would have crumbled. But now you might think we have a different worry, right? The worry here might be, well, look, if intervention of the kind that I've advocated would also have led to regime change, right, then aren't we just back with the problem of improper political interference? What then has become of this thought, of the idea of the rights of people to determine their own affairs free from violent or coercive interference, which I've described as human sovereignty? Well, the answer to that, I think, is that it makes all the difference how an action, an intervening action, a forceful action, it makes all the difference how an action leads to political transformation. We have to distinguish between justified violent acts that have political consequences on the one hand and acts of political violence on the other. The later, right, political acts of political violence are ruled out by human sovereignty, whereas the former need not be. And to see this, consider a hypothetical case. Suppose that I'm summoned to the Oval Office for an interview with President Obama, and he suddenly and inexplicably flies into a violent rage and tries to kill me. Sorry, I couldn't get through, even though this is a talk about real things, I couldn't get through the talk without giving at least one crazy hypothetical. Right? Obama flies into an inexplicable violent rage and tries to kill me. And I kill him in self-defense because it's the only thing that I can do, right? Now, my killing of the president is a violent act with profound political consequences, right, obviously. But it's not a political act, right? It's not a political act. And similarly, if a humanitarian intervention removes the ability of a regime to sustain itself by murdering and intimidating its own citizens, then the political transformation that results will clearly be a consequence of the intervention. But that does not mean that the intervention is an act of political violence in any objectionable way. Now, that might seem like a casuistic distinction. And I'll admit it's a very, very fine one, and it may be an extremely difficult one to apply in a lot of cases, but I do think it's a crucial one. Permissible intervention is proportionate action to defend basic human rights from imminent attack that simultaneously creates the possibility of a more legitimate political process. The permissible political objectives of humanitarian intervention is nothing less, but crucially also nothing more, than to open up and defend a space in which a non-violent indigenous political process consistent with the right of human sovereignty can take place.